Another new feature is the ability to use Vue's VOB object format as object generators within ecosystems if you're using a compatible object, being a vegetation plant object or one of the rock template objects. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we can use this. What we're going to do is let's go ahead and modify the maple tree in this ecosystem. What I'm going to do is load in, first I'm going to load in the alder late spring, and I'm going to use the leaves on the tree and transfer them over to the maple. So we'll load in the maple tree, and what I'm going to do is go to that alder species, and in the aspect tab I can move over to one of the two image maps for the leaves, and we'll use the first in the list, copy the material, and then go over to the maple tree, and we can paste it on the maple leaf. And then what I'm also going to do is edit the material, and that way we have different names so we can kind of tell the difference between which material is on which object. So maple leaves, and even though these aren't maple leaves, we'll still call this maple leaves natural, just so we know which tree it's on. Click OK. And we could also go into the object and make further modifications. If you want to edit where the hooking point is, we could modify that. We could make changes to the flexibility, curl, make any changes you need to. And previously what you would need to do is save a new plant species in order to be able to populate the ecosystem with it. And now what we can do is just save the object. And I'm going to call this maple tree natural leaves, and just save the object. And click OK. And now we can go into the ecosystem, and we can either add it to the existing list, or we can replace and get rid of the other maple tree. I'll just go ahead and get rid of the other maple tree, and then load in an object, so we can add an object. And I have my objects library already added in as a collection. What we could also do is browse the file, and it should take us right to the list. So we could also grab it from there. Now we're going to get a dialog. Now this has to do with the wind modifications if you were to use the wind handle on a plant, or if you were to set up any sort of animation on the plant, animating it over the timeline, animating its growth maybe. So if you want to keep any custom animation and not have variations, then what you do is keep the plant as it is. Or we can discard plant modifications. Now this does not include the changes we made to the species, whether we were to change the branches, gnarl them, change the length. It won't affect those. Those settings will still be preserved when generating the new objects. So this really has to do just with modifications to animation and growth over time. So we're going to discard the plant modifications, which will still preserve our material and any changes we made in the editor. So as long as the changes are made in the plant editor and not animated or changed over time, they'll be preserved. So now we can populate, and we have our new maple tree. I'm going to go ahead and switch over my display to just smooth shaded for all of the objects and get a higher res preview. And then we can see the new maple trees with those new leaves on them. And this is the maple tree right here. The preview is a lot lower res than the actual render, as you can see in the render preview to the right, which is why it doesn't look all that dense. But that will also work for any of the rock objects. So this is great, so you can make your own rock collections, changing the material, because before what you would have to do is add in rock species and then change the material for the ecosystem materials and change it afterwards, and then you could only have one of the same rock within each ecosystem population. So this way you can load in a rock object, and then modify the material. We could change this over to, go ahead and select a rock. Let's use red brown rock. And then we can save the object. And keep in mind too, another thing I want to mention is that when you do this rotation and however you have the scale set for the object will become the new default in how it is oriented on the surface. So this is another way to kind of customize rocks and plants. I'm just going to cancel this really quick because I do want to go to the rotation and set it back to 0. Click OK. And now I'm going to go into the ecosystem. We can add an object and we can select that rock. And then it's going to automatically create the variations for the new rock object species based on that new material that was added. So we could also make changes to scale to customize. You could even use the twist rotation tools. And we can see those rocks starting to show up throughout the ecosystem using the new orientation if you have one. Going back and looking at the way we can set sort of a default rotation orientation for the object, what I'll go ahead and do is first I'm just going to get rid of the rock object from this. We'll go ahead and clear the ecosystem for the moment. I'm just going to reduce the scale here and also just kind of get rid of those other objects in the scene. Go ahead and populate. Now what we could do before, and this is still a possibility, is you can go into the library tab and select from the ecosystem population to edit these objects. So let's go ahead and take the maple tree, that new one that was added in. We can right click and go to master object addition mode. Now we can make changes to scale, and we could also twist the object, change the orientation. So it was possible before to do this. And I'm going to rotate it on the side, or just kind of bend it over a little bit, and exit the isolation mode. Clear and repopulate, and we should see those trees kind of bent over a little more. Might need to refresh the view in order for that to show up properly. So it does look like the tree is bent over a little bit more. It's kind of swaying to the side. It might be more effective on the original vegetation species. So let's go ahead and take the alder, use the master object addition mode, zoom in so we can see it, and bend it over to the side. Exit the isolation mode. And repopulate that. And it looks like maybe it's not refreshing. Sometimes the orientation doesn't show up when you change it this way in the preview. So now that I switched this, we can see it did modify the rotation of that plant. So it doesn't add a whole lot of extra features in that way, but if we were to use some of the other modifications, mainly scale, if we were to use the twist function, which is pretty cool, it's really more of a skew. We'll go ahead and just load in a maple tree and we'll take a look at the twist function and how we could use that. If we go to twist and start to kind of bend the tree, we could make modifications that way to compensate maybe for a direction change within the plant itself, or just create a more interesting, gnarled looking plant. And the problem is when you start making changes like this within the Master Object Edition mode, it does have a tendency to flatten out and destroy one of the object axes on its scale. That can happen, and then you end up with a pretty much useless plant that you have to delete and re-add in. So this way, if we were to save this as a VOB object, we can modify these settings a lot easier and have more control over them, and then save the object out. So that also goes for rocks too, and that way you can create more angles and sharp edges on some of them. For instance, we'll go ahead and take a look at one of the rocks, just how we could use that. So load in a rock here, and I'm going to reset the rotation on it. If we wanted to have it kind of go the other way, can rotate that to the side. So this would be our new default rotation. So now if we go to the twist function, we can kind of slant the object, and it's just really a lot easier. Now, typically if you do this more than once, what will happen is it'll kind of reset one of the other axes and the twist for it. There are ways to do it manually by using the global rotation and then scaling it, and that will make sure that it's not reset. But it gives you a lot more control over shaping objects, and really some neat stuff you can do with the rocks. So then we could save this out as a VOB object, and that will become kind of the new settings for the generator, and that will be applied to every object. I do want to note that when you save these as objects and load them in as EcoSystems, it will have to generate a new cache file. This is a cache file for all the ecosystem objects. Every time you load in an ecosystem object or an object as an ecosystem, it will generate the variations and create a cached file for those variations, which means if you want to generate new variations, you can also delete these cached files. But it will not use the original. It will generate a new one for the object, so you don't really save on file size there. But the VOB object format itself, as opposed to, say, the veg format, if we were to save a species, is a lot smaller. So you can kind of take advantage of that a little, which is pretty nice. And since before there was really no way to save your own rocks and have them generated, that also adds that ability, which is pretty cool.